The Debacle by Emile Zola, book review. So, this book, I came across it because of my interest in the Paris Commune, which was a historical event. I was reading a lot about it, and I've always liked historical fiction. I've always kind of found that's the best way for me to learn history. So I was searching on the internet for fictional depictions of the Paris Commune, or the Paris Commune in historical fiction. And this popped up on some website, I forget where, as kind of the most famous example of the Paris Commune in literature. Is it the most famous example? I don't know, I guess we can debate that, but a famous one. So I ordered this through Amazon, got it, and kind of plunged in. Now, this is by Emile Zola, who's kind of a famous French writer. It's a classic book of sorts. It was published in 1892. But it turns out this is also part of a larger series. Now, I'm going to mispronounce this because I can't speak French. I read the book in translation. It's called Le Rougon-Macquart series. I don't know, look it up online because I'm sure I'm not pronouncing it right. But it's a 20-book series in which Emile Zola kind of traces the history of two families over the whole period of the Second Empire in France. It's supposedly kind of, I've not read the whole series, but I've not read any of the series except for this book. Although I'd be interested, maybe someday. I mean, I know 20 books is a big reading commitment, but I kind of like to read kind of these epic series and kind of watch the story evolve. But apparently it's very hard to track down the whole series in English, at least according to Wikipedia. Some of these books, all of these books apparently have been translated into English at one time over the past 150 years. But some of them haven't been currently published in English for quite some time. So you could track them all down if you wanted to, but it would take some doing. But apparently, this series is kind of one of the hallmarks of kind of realism in literature. So Zola is trying to kind of trace out a realistic portrayal of kind of what would happen to a middle-class family in the Second Empire. And he's also interested in the idea of kind of nature versus nurture, kind of seeing how these characters kind of grow up and kind of what genes they have and how that kind of affects the kind of adults they turn out to be, apparently. So this book, The Debacle, is 19 out of 20 in the series. Although, again, according to Wikipedia, apparently it's not quite a linear story progression. It's just kind of a series of different stories about kind of one overarching family. And some of the books connect to each other and some of them don't. But, yeah, there are some books, some of these characters have appeared in kind of books before this series. You can still kind of get your head around it, even though some of the characters are being reintroduced from other books. I think Zola wanted to make each book stand independently, so all the characters who have appeared in previous books are kind of reintroduced, and you're kind of reintroduced to their backstory. Also, at least in my edition, the edition published by Penguin Classics, there's a lengthy translator's introduction, which kind of catches you up on everything you need to know. Still, there's a lot of new names kind of flying at the reader. So the first 50 pages or so of this novel are a little bit bumpy, but kind of after the first 50 pages, I had more or less figured out who everyone is. So if you just kind of soldier on past those first 50 pages, then it's okay. Then it starts to all make sense. So like I said, I had tracked this book down because I was interested in the Paris Commune. But as it turns out, this book isn't really that much about the Paris Commune. It's a 500-page book, and we don't even get to Paris until the last 50 pages, let alone the Paris Commune. So you wouldn't want to read this book just because of the Paris Commune. But as it turns out, it's an interesting book in its own right. Most of the book is about the Battle at Sedan, which is kind of a disastrous French military disaster in the Franco-Prussian War. And this, even though this wasn't what I had bought the book for, this was very interesting on its own right. So I'd recommend it for that. And again, according to the translator's introduction, Zola had researched this book thoroughly before he wrote it. Now, the Paris Commune and the Battle at Sedan happened, I think, in 1870 and 1871. This book came out in 1892, so you know it was still very much within living memory. Again, according to the translator's introduction, Zola talked to a lot of eyewitnesses at the Battle of Sedan, and apparently kind of every incident in the book is kind of based on something that an eyewitness had told him had happened to the Battle of Sedan. I think he changed things around and kind of, you know, made it so things happened to his own characters instead of the people they really happened to, but all the incidents come out of real life. Something that struck me as I was kind of reading about the Battle of Sedan, and I don't know, maybe this is just me, but you know, like I tend to think there's modern warfare, like, you know, like World War II with the planes and the bombs and the machine guns. And then there's kind of the old warfare, you know, the ancient warfare with, you know, the soldiers in lines kind of marching up hand-to-hand combat. This gave me this was a description of a battle in 1870, which gave me an interesting view of a transition between old warfare and modern warfare. So we don't quite have the planes yet, but we do have bombardments. I mean, they've got the cannons, which can shoot out missiles and are kind of, it's not an aerial bombardment, but there is kind of this town gets kind of thoroughly shelled by the cannons, what would you call them? Yeah, there's bombings going on even though it's not coming from airplanes. Also, you get like a sense of like there's no machine guns, but I think like they have the Gatling gun. You get a sense of like this kind of hail of bullets that the artillery is able to produce. So it's an interesting picture of kind of warfare that's kind of almost reached the full horrors of modern war, but not quite yet. Something that struck me very clearly, there's kind of one scene where the soldiers need to charge into this hail of enemy bullets coming at them. And it's very vivid. You get a clear sense of just kind of what these soldiers are facing and how much bravery they need to do to just kind of charge into these enemy bullets. I don't think I could have done it, but you get a sense of kind of what the characters need to do to face that. Because of all the emphasis on the horrors of war, this book kind of leads in nicely to All Quiet on the Western Front, which I just got done reading before this one. Perhaps if you consider that the Franco-Prussian War was really the precursor to World War I, like it created the conditions that would later result in World War I, then then they really kind of lead into each other nicely. Sorry, nicely is the wrong word to talk about this, huh? Smoothly. Now, Zola didn't live to see World War I. He died beforehand. And although his book is very kind of pessimistic about warfare in general, he does kind of attempt to end the book on an optimistic note. But obviously, now that we know the history of the 20th century, that optimistic note was not borne out by history. Something the translator notes, Zola's vision of war as a tyranny of the powerful over the innocent makes the debacle a disturbing prophecy of the 20th century. Now, about the Paris Commune, and again, this is only the last 50 pages of a 500-page novel, but this was one of my interests. Zola, he was a liberal Republican. He was famous for kind of the Dreyfus case in the 1890s. He was anti-clerical and he was anti-emperor. But he's not quite a radical, and he does not paint a positive picture of the Paris Commune. The communards are described as scoundrels, and kind of one of the main villains of the book, kind of the scoundrel Chateau, I'm pronouncing that wrong, I'm sure, kind of joins up with the Paris Commune, and he's kind of portrayed as just kind of being like typical, like all of the Paris Commune people are like this kind of scoundrel. The translator's introduction, again, makes note of the fact that Zola is really anti-commune. And so he says, translator says, you probably want to read Karl Marx's The Civil War in France, just to kind of balance this portrayal out. Now, I actually was reading Karl Marx's The Civil War in France while I was reading this. Not because of the translator's introduction, but just because of coincidence. I also had that on my bookshelf. And the differences between them are interesting. At the end of the Paris Commune, a number of the prominent buildings in Paris, particularly the buildings associated with the upper classes and the bourgeois, are set on fire. And this is kind of at the point where the communards of Paris Commune know they're going to lose. So one of Zola's characters said, quoting from the book, "It was the fires, more than anything else, which infuriated him. Burn down houses and public buildings just because you weren't the strongest? No, that was really the end. Only criminals could be capable of such things." So that's one view. Karl Marx, over in The Civil War in France, talks about this huge outrage, the outrage that the communards had burned down the buildings. And he makes a point that in every other war, it's considered accepted practice to burn down the buildings. He talks about the British burning down Washington, D.C. in the War of 1812, or burning down the White House. He also talks about the British and the French burning down the Summer Palace in the Arrow War in China. And so he says, well, you know, if they can do it when they go abroad and fight foreign countries, then why can't the proletariat do it during a class war? You know, if it's acceptable in a foreign war or in these imperialist wars, why isn't it acceptable in a class war? Which I thought was a good point on Marx's side. But after the commune falls and you get to the repression of the commune, then Zola and Marx seem to be on the same page here, because Zola is also repulsed at the massacre following the fall of the Paris Commune. And again, quoting from the book here, quoting from Zola, he says, "The butchery was frightful. Men and even children condemned on just one piece of evidence, such as hands dirty with powder, or feet that happened to be wearing army boots. Innocent people falsely denounced, victims of personal vendettas, screaming explanations, but unable to make themselves heard. Droves of people herded in front of rifle barrels. So many poor devils at once that there were not enough bullets to go around, and the wounded were finished off with the butts of rifles. Blood ran in streams, and carts were taking away the bodies from morning till night. All over the city, executions were going on." End quote. Also, another point that's in both Zola and Marx is they talk about how well these massacres were going on. The upper classes were just kind of laughing and enjoying themselves in the cafes. It's a point Marx kind of made in the Civil War in France, and it's a point that comes through in Emile Zola's kind of fictional depiction of the fall of the Paris Commune. Two more notes before I finish this. Note number one. Because this is a war story, and because this is the second to the last book in the series, Zola is really starting to kind of kill everyone off now. So lots of characters die. It's a sad book. Now, I don't mind sad stories, especially kind of when the sadness comes naturally from the story. But I don't like being manipulated. I don't like it when the author is trying too hard to make me feel sad. I want the sadness to just kind of be natural from the circumstances. I felt like Zola was trying a little bit too hard to make me feel sad here. Zola wants to make each death just as tragic as possible. So for example, one man right before he is executed, we're told he has visions of his life and his wife and his family. Another man dies clutching a love letter. Another man is killed by his best friend in the Paris Commune during the Civil War part. Lots of sad speeches. I just thought it was a little bit over the top. Point two, there is a lot of talking about food in this book. I don't know, maybe it's just because it's a French book, but there's so much description of bread and cheese and wine and coffee. They're always talking about bread and cheese and wine and coffee. And then there's a section, where the soldiers are starving, where they're kind of, they don't have food, and there's large descriptions of how hungry they are and how much they want bread and cheese and wine and coffee. So I was always reading this book, and I was thinking, oh boy, I could go for some bread and cheese and wine and coffee. And I'd be reading this book at school, and then I'd finish school and I'd run to the supermarket, I'd buy a bunch of bread and cheese and wine and coffee and get home and scarf it down. And I think I actually gained a little bit of weight while reading this book. So be forewarned.